Mute.
Go.
Hello, Archer parents and families. Thank you so much for being here this evening. We know that it's been an extremely busy week with lots of information about lateral flow testing, the return to school, Year 11 exams. But we feel this evening is now a chance to just sit back and reflect upon yourselves as parents and your children and help us work with you to ensure that your children have the very best start back at school next week. If you do have any questions about the things I've just mentioned, please reach out to your child's tutor or head of year, because we are all prepared to help you and support you with those questions you may have around the start of term. But this evening, what we want to do is have a really wonderful presentation from Sophia Davidson, our child and adolescent psychotherapist, and then we will talk through our wellbeing offer to show you how we are supporting students in our school and show you that we can support during this difficult time. There will also be the opportunity to see how you can reach out to us to get support. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Sophia, who will lead on tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much, Jo. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, I hope I can't see myself. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Thank you so much for attending this presentation this evening. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the fact that we have been living in a pandemic for almost a year, and that whilst it has been challenging for all of us in the Archer community, for some listeners, it may have been especially hard. There may be key workers on the front line in the audience, people who have lost loved ones to COVID, and people whose lives have been economically impacted. My heart goes out to you. And so whilst this is primarily a talk about supporting your children, I want to start with you. All of what I'm going to talk about applies to us, the adults, and my hope is that if I can help you to understand just why this is so difficult, it will in turn enable you to help your children navigate this hugely challenging situation. So in thinking about this talk and what might be helpful, I thought we should do the following. I'm going to break this talk into 3 parts. Firstly, we'll think a bit about why the pandemic has been so psychologically difficult. Within this, I'm going to explain how our triune brain works and the role it plays in how we navigate threat. And I'm going to liken COVID to living under a pre-traumatic cloud and examine how applying principles of trauma-informed therapy can help us all. Secondly, we're going to think about looking after ourselves to better support our children, which will cover some practical suggestions and will address when we need to be more concerned and seek additional support for ourselves. Finally, I will speak about building our window of tolerance as a means of managing uncertainty before thinking a bit about anxiety and how we can help our children. So the pandemic, why is it so difficult for us? I'm using a diagram that some of you will be familiar with, that developed by Abraham Maslow in 1943, interestingly, during another globally challenging time. Maslow identified the different needs which humans have to have met in order to get on and do the best in their lives. So why does he matter when we think of COVID? Well, if we briefly look at his diagram, it's clear that the pandemic has hit us at every level, particularly the bottom 2. COVID has disrupted resources, employment, health, and our sense of personal safety. Added to this, we have been prevented from connecting with others, an essential component for a social species such as ours. Faced with a prolonged period of stress, such as we are currently living with, it strikes me as inevitable that we will all have had our fear response systems in overdrive. and I will briefly explain why this is the case with a diagram of what is called the triune brain. The triune brain, literally 3 in 1, is a simple way of understanding the 3 distinct parts of the brain that we all have. When we're responding to threat, it is the primal reptilian bit which is most active. Concerned with our survival, it perceives danger and responds. Crucially, it does so without recruiting the other 2 parts of the brain, both the mammal brain and the human brain, flooding our bodies with adrenaline and taking our thinking offline. The brain is brilliant, but it is also blunt in its approach. Any threat is managed in the same way, and this is proving to be problematic in the face of a pandemic. The pandemic is an ongoing threat, which means that our reptilian primal brain is sensing danger. Flooded with adrenaline, the effect that has is it puts us in a hypervigilant state. We cannot sustain a hypervigilant state for a prolonged time. Our fear response system is designed for short, sharp periods of action followed by respite, but the pandemic has denied us this. Instead, we have spent close to a year going in and out of this hypervigilant state. Where we go, what we hear from the media, what we see in our communities, what our friends and family tell us, all of it contributes to this in and out hypervigilant state. And that makes us emotionally up and down, and also our children. We all manage this in our own way. Some of us retreat or cut off from how we feel. Others might be irritable. In the case of children, we might expect that they would lash out a bit more or be more tearful. Some experience more bodily symptoms. Children have been particularly prone to sore tummies and headaches. Difficulties with sleep or appetite also occur. And for some of us, I know this is true for me, there've been occasions of what I would liken to brain fog, a feeling that I just can't do the stuff that used to be so easy. Some of us have been less affected, others more, but both on an individual and on a societal level, the ongoing nature of this is probably the hardest component. I think it really needs to be acknowledged that COVID has caused and is continuing to cause trauma. Indeed, Bessel van der Kolk, probably the most well-known psychologist writing about trauma, has likened the pandemic to living under a pre-traumatic cloud. What does he mean, and how can the principles of trauma-informed therapy protect us from over-recruiting our fear response systems? I found this image online, and I think it perfectly captures what van der Kolk means. The heavy clouds are where we are, and in the distance there is a further storm, indicating that this might not all be smooth sailing, but wonderfully there is also light. It will get better, and you will navigate the ongoing uncertainty better if you are able to attend to your own needs as well as those of your children. My hope is that in helping you to understand a little about trauma and sharing with you proven strategies that help mitigate it, you will feel better able to support yourselves and thus your children. Being in a structure where you cannot do what you would ordinarily do, where you are basically rendered helpless to change it, that is the definition of trauma. Trauma develops where there is an absence of predictability and trust. When the external world is unpredictable, it is all the more important that we make our own lives as predictable as possible. Trauma-informed work, which I use as a clinician, follows 4 principles, those of structure, connection, movement and engagement, and practicing our competencies. And I'll say a bit more about each of these. Structure. Structure in the form of boundaries, expectations, predictability, all help combat our feelings of helplessness. You and your children need a predictable structure with times to wake, eat, work, move, connect with others and sleep. Schools are brilliant at this. They cue it. we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and later on we're going to do that. And I would encourage all of us, myself included, to be doing it at home. Schedule something to look forward to every day, however modest it is. And hold in mind that often we think teenagers should be better at structure than they are. They seem so grown up in so many areas of their life that we think they can manage this. In my experience, both as a psychotherapist and a mum, they can't. We need to contain them with a structure and be creative in how we nudge them to comply. So text them or phone them to check in and remind them of what you need them to do if you can't be there. And perhaps we should hold in mind that we might need to negotiate some of this in terms of weekends and holidays, as it can be a key component of the next important principle, connection. Humans are built for connection. We all need meaningful connections with others, and like it or not, a key component of this is digital, i.e. screen-based. In my dealings with parents, and as a parent myself, it is clear that managing screen time can be a source of significant tension. So in looking at connection, I'm going to focus on what we in the mental health field increasingly call our digital diet. The reality is that we are moving to a state of digital by default in many areas of life. I pose these questions because families need to think about what's right for them. What does your and your children's digital diet look like? When is it happening and for how long? What constitutes a balanced social media diet? And what sort of online world do you want to be part of? My feeling is that once we're through the pandemic, we will have to decide what we carry on doing on screen and what to pick up again in person. I'm expecting that aspects of work, social contact, education and healthcare will be delivered in hybrid ways in the future. And our relationship to screens and the online world is going to need to address this. The research in this area is fascinating, and it broadly identifies what is helpful and what is not when it comes to our online lives. So it is a brilliant way of communicating and connecting when face-to-face contact is not possible. It's super for what we call active engagement, gaming, with the usual caveat that these games should be age appropriate, learning, stop motion animation, taking up a new hobby. All of this is good stuff. I think it's also important to acknowledge that the social media side of things in the online world can be quite protective for those who are socially anxious and who might find those activities an easier way of connecting with others. The other two key things are, it is helpful when we, the adults, model non-screen related activities. And it's also helpful if we reward our children when they are doing activities which are not screen-based. The unhelpful will not surprise you. Scrolling through posts while comparing your life to that of someone's on a screen rarely makes us feel better about ourselves, and it certainly doesn't help with adolescent self-esteem. Not taking a critical view of posts is something that I think we as parents need to talk to our adolescents about. I am really struck by the fact that whether it's TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram, this generation has a tendency to accept at face value what they're seeing. Screen use 1 hour before bed is counterproductive if we want children to sleep. You will all know that from the blue light component. And clearly, if screens are being used to the exclusion of all activities, I think we need to be concerned. In the spirit of trying to encourage a break from our digital lives, we'll now look at the importance of movement and engagement and practicing our competencies, both of which are also protective factors from trauma. Movement enables us to feel strength in our bodies. It combats the sense of feeling trapped. Movement disperses adrenaline. When we move, we quieten our alert system. Exercise impacts our mood. It releases endorphins, and I would encourage you to try and find out the sorts of exercises your teenagers might like. And thinking back to boundaries and expectations, I would encourage you to make it part of their schedule, and I would reward it, a walk and then Wi-Fi. Finally, we know that a further way to feel a greater sense of agency in our lives is to practice our competencies. We all have something that we're good at and that we enjoy. Can you think of something that is just for fun rather than focused on achievement? The hobbies that we can lose ourselves in, cooking, sewing, art, you will have lots of other ideas, no doubt. Having looked at why the pandemic is so challenging for us and explored what can help, I'd like to turn our attention to looking after ourselves in order to look after our children. Again, I'm posing some questions which you might want to give some thought to. How would you know if you were struggling and needed support? What would cause you to worry about your child? Hold in mind that when we are stressed, we all regress. That's also true for us, and it's especially true for children. And it's to be expected. In fact, I would say it is a normal reaction and it is not a sign of illness. Certain transitions may have been harder. So for instance, some of you may have older children who've not had the university experience they wanted or the sixth form one, and year 7 may have been more unsettled than older students who were more familiar with the Archer Way. And at the same time, parents will want to know, when is it more concerning? So we will now look at when does it move from coping to struggling to being unwell. You will note that there's quite a lot of overlap, notably in areas like sleep, appetite, being irritable, and a general lack of interest in things. And anecdotally, I think that's grown in this last lockdown. I certainly have felt more ambivalent about things. Sleep in older adolescents has been much more likely to look like a reversal of day and night, and that might be something to give some thought to ahead of coming back to school. I think it's important we think about what our teenagers should be doing and what they're actually allowed to. And the point I wish to make is that night is one of the very few occasions at the moment when they can feel some freedom away from us. You know, they're denied the chance to go out at the moment, and I think a lot of them are staying up late because it enables them to feel alone. Obviously, it isn't helpful in the school week, but boundaries might need to be gradually imposed. And in particular, I think we need to think about negotiating over this at the weekends. Loss of appetite is normal when we're stressed, but keep an eye because sometimes it reveals emotional difficulty in our children. For instance, in my other work at a clinic, we have seen an increase in eating disorders, likely tied to the lack of control people perceive in other areas of their life, and referrals for this sort of thing are up by 1/3 nationally. In addition, we've seen an increase in OCD, with children engaging in rituals as a means of managing anxiety. My advice to you is, if you're worried, talk to the school and talk to your GP. And thinking about ourselves for a moment, I want to acknowledge how hard it can be on our own relationships too. Finding space for ourselves really matters. Lockdown has been challenging for couples and for those who are parenting separately. You may not have been co-parenting in the way that you now are. Disagreements over parenting teenagers is common. We might want to replicate how we were parented or do the opposite, and we don't always agree. What we do know is this: parental stress really impacts on children. Even if it doesn't look like open conflict, if the feelings are there, children will sense it, and it will have an impact on how they manage their own relationships. So do seek additional support if you feel you need it. If our own minds feel a bit calmer because we're managing to get our needs met, we can make space for what's going on in our children's minds and help them to navigate the uncertainty that the pandemic has generated by expanding what we call our window of tolerance. We all respond to uncertainty differently. Some children need lots and lots of take-up time before any plan is put into fruition. They need to know every detail. Others take it all effortlessly in their stride. But We can all build our tolerance to uncertainty. Do little things that expose you to manageable uncertainty. Go out without your phone, try food that you wouldn't typically have, go for a walk without checking the weather. Little things that enable us to experience that slight anxiety, and it is manageable. Think about limiting your and your children's exposure to the media. I'm not sure it's actually been very helpful, how much we've been bombarded with information about COVID. Focus on what you can control. Predictability leads to security. And in particular, encourage your children to stay in the here and now rather than worrying about their future, which leads me to thinking about how we manage those inevitable what if and should have, could have conversations. What if conversations typically cause anxiety. What if I don't do well in my exams? What if I can't have the sixth form experience I want? What if Granny gets COVID? What if things don't go back to normal for ages? Adolescents are especially prone to these sorts of conversations, so keep an eye out, and if you feel that you need to intervene, suggest that they identify the what if that they are most worried about and start a conversation about it with the words, then what? Then what encourages us to plan. And when we do this, we avoid catastrophizing and we are modeling something valuable and transferable to lots of different situations. We lose heart when we either lose sight of a goal or we don't know what the steps are that we need to take. Breaking it down into manageable parts helps get us out of a loop of ruminating about the what ifs. The other type of thought, which typically causes rumination, is the one that begins, I should have, or I could have. I should have started revising ages ago. I could have used lockdown so much more productively. Note in yourself if you're having these conversations and recognise it for what it is. Anxious thoughts, which are often counterproductive. And if you spot it in your teenagers, name it. That's a should have, could have thought. Where's that come from? Anxiety is especially pernicious, so it might be helpful to remind ourselves of what helps. In situations of extreme anxiety, hold in mind that it's our old friend, the reptilian brain, who's in charge. So trying to recruit thinking skills is likely to be unhelpful. I liken it to needing a circuit breaker to interrupt the anxiety loop, and the things that do this are body rather than head based. I've talked before to parents about focusing on breathing, and that together with exercises that ground us, like the one on the slide, which gets us to note 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, and so on, help get us out of fight, flight, anxious mode and into rest and digest mode. Anxious thoughts typically don't respond to reassurance. I say that because I think as parents, we're really quick to try to reassure in the face of anxiety because we want our children to feel better. But if you think of a situation where you felt anxious, I've got a job interview, I'm really worried about it, a cheery, you're going to be fine response often doesn't help. And the same is absolutely true for our children. Children don't have the long-term perspective that we do, and they will struggle to see that things will improve. If they're anxious about the pandemic, they need their worries to be empathised with. And remember that empathy rarely begins with those 2 words, at least. Finally, in helping our children, it's useful to remember the following. Listening is really, really powerful. Adolescents often don't want us to say anything. In fact, I encourage you to ask them. I find sometimes saying, do you want me to say something or do you just want me to listen? They'll tell you what they want. And often it's just to offload. It's a form of containment. We take their unmanageable thoughts and in the process, we lighten their emotional load. All behaviour is a communication of sorts. Ask yourself, what is my child trying to tell me through their actions? When our children are at their most impossible, remember there's often a paradox in play. What they bring is attention seeking. is often a misguided way of having a connection or contact with you. Believe me when I say they need boundaries, even if they tell you otherwise, even if they say you're the only person who does it. And at the same time, this situation is a time that calls for flexibility, and that should extend to our expectations too. Validate how they feel. It's really important to acknowledge their loss and disappointment. This has been hugely hard for our children, and they need to see that we get it. Use reflective listening to help your child develop their emotional language, because it will help them understand themselves better and it breeds resiliency. Open-ended questions help avoid defensiveness. Adolescents are particularly prone at getting defensive. But if you begin conversations with things like, I wonder if you're feeling sad as well as angry, or help me understand what's going on, we dial down that defensiveness. Emphasize their strengths. Our children have been so adaptable, so celebrate what they're doing well. Be calm when you can, and when you can't, remember that all of us lose it sometimes. It's really empowering to say to your child, I did the same thing as you, I lost my temper. Not only are you teaching your child about what emotions mean and do, but you're giving them a structure to understand how they work. And if you think you behaved badly, apologise. That is also hugely powerful. Thank you so much for listening. I'm aware that you have busy lives, so thank you for giving up part of your evening to attend this.
Thank you so much, Sophia. We always say at school, after Sophia has spoken to us, we always feel more intelligent. So I hope that you are feeling that right now. And I also hope that as parents, you are giving yourselves a big pat on the back for getting through this very hard and difficult time. And as much as we know it has been hard, we want you to know that we want to move on, and we want to make sure that we find success and things to look forward to as we move forward. So I now want to just go through some slides of our wellbeing offer in school. And whilst you absorb all of the wonderful information that Sophia has shared with you, please do post any questions that you may have in the chat. Please also make any comments or suggestions, because we really want your feedback on what has been helpful, if there are any other topics that might support you in understanding children or adolescents or being a parent, because we do hope that we can continue to do webinars like this and present to you on a regular basis through various mediums. So what do we have on offer currently for wellbeing at the Archer Academy for our students? As Sophia has highlighted, routines and expectations. We have a clear behaviour policy. We want every child to feel safe. We know that we have routines around school. We have routines around every part of the child's day. That is a form of security that supports each and every one of us. We have a strong pastoral system, and many of you will have been contacted frequently by your child's tutor or head of year or learning mentor or counsellor throughout school closure. Communication is really important to us. We have the student wellbeing hubs where students can go and find resources for themselves to help themselves. We have the house system where students can be part of a further level of pastoral care and be involved in competitions, activities, and hopefully the music house competition, dance house competition, and all of these wonderful events that we hope to get back into school very quickly. Student leadership and student voice is really important in the school, and we have as many opportunities as possible for students to develop those leadership skills and have a sense of responsibility as they come back into school. We've got our Diversity and Inclusion Society to make sure that we are checking ourselves and we have equality across the school. Our student services officers support those children with medical conditions, but are also there to help with uniform and equipment and the child who's a bit upset on a day-to-day basis. Our pastoral support worker works with students and runs interventions around behaviour. And we've also got our mentoring and counselling provision, as well as Rufus, our wonderful school dog. We are always reaching out to external agencies, and some of you may have worked with external agencies with the school. We have good relationships with the local authority and CAMS, and we work with them frequently. We are also looking, can I have the next slide, please? We are also thinking about how we're evolving our wellbeing provision, and we're doing this all of the time. Thanks to our wonderful parent body, we have had our funding from the Big Give project, and that's allowed us to expand our counselling capacity. We are looking to start our therapy in the summer term. We are looking to develop a series of parental webinars, and we are also looking to further support students in their understanding of each other to have peer mentoring training. So at the beginning of March, in the middle of March, our Year 9s are going to have some peer mentoring training from the Anna Freud Centre. We've had whole school staff training by the Anna Freud Centre yesterday to support staff in preparing themselves to returning to school next week. We have started to train staff who are interested in mental health training, and we also have our outdoor classroom project, which is underway, and you may have seen that on social media, and I will come back to that in a moment. We're constantly, may I have the next slide please, signposting to students how they can look after themselves. And this slide they will be very familiar with. It's often used at the end of assemblies or the end of lessons and in tutor time. We're constantly reminding students of how they can get support, who they can talk to, and where they can go online to look for resources. So we hope that you and your families and your students find that really helpful. And moving on to the good news and the things that we are looking forward to, you may know that we are developing our garden project, our outdoor classroom, which is going to be really there to support everybody's well-being. We hope that it will be a space for counselling, for mentoring, for learning, and we are reaching out to our parent body for anybody who's interested in supporting this. Please do email us on the volunteer at the Archer Academy email and let us know if you would like to be involved. We are looking for keen gardeners, for people that might want to support in the running of the garden in the future. So thank you to those of you who may also have already volunteered. So Sophia shared with me today this survey that's come from the local authority, and they are very interested in hearing from parents about how we support children in schools and well-being for children. So if you do want to support that, but Sophia and I would be very grateful if you want to complete the survey, and we will share that to you in the chat. But also we really want to hear from you, whether you have found this helpful, whether there is anything else that you would like to know from us, whether there's anything else you feel that the school can offer. So we'd now like to go to some questions. Myself, Mr. Latter and Sophia are here, and we can answer questions now or potentially get back to you at another time if you would like to have a private conversation with us. We are here for you to support you, and if you do have a child who's very worried about returning to school next week, please make sure that you contact the child's tutor or head of year or one of us, and we will make sure that we can alleviate any concerns that you may have. So I would now like to hand over to Mr. Latter, who may compare some questions for us. Thank you.
Hello, good evening everybody. Thank you for attending. I've been overseeing the chat and the questions in the Q&A function here in Microsoft Teams. So if you do have any more questions that you want to ask, it's not too late to get those in to us now, and we will do our best to answer all of them. So Miss Marnie, I might just ask a sort of practical one. There's a couple of these have come in which are just about how can we get copies of the slides or the recording, particularly of Sophia's presentation.
Thank you. That's a very brilliant question, and I should have explained that at the start of the presentation. I will be sharing the link to this presentation in the newsletter that will go out tomorrow. And also, if you want to email me, I can email it to you directly, but it will be in the newsletter tomorrow.
Thank you, Miss Marnie. There's a question for you, Sophia, I think. So it says, earlier Sophia mentioned seek help if necessary. Are there any recommendations as to where to seek help? And I wanted to know whether perhaps Sophia, you wanted to talk more generally in the community in terms of, GPs, etc. And then we could talk, Miss Marnie or I could talk about specific support in school, if that would be helpful.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. Do we think this is seeking help for a child or for parents?
Good question. It doesn't stipulate, so why don't we take those two together and we can dissect as needed.
Sure. So in many ways, my advice would be the same. I think if you as a parent are feeling that you need some additional support, I would always recommend that you talk to your GP. There is a recognition, thankfully, that this has had a huge impact on communities, and as such there is lots of support available in the form of online and increasingly face-to-face therapy as well. So that would always be my first recommendation. If you're talking about your child, we know that GPs are a good starting point because they are able to refer to CAMS should they think that is appropriate. And for some young people, it is appropriate, absolutely. I'm sure Leo or Joe will say more, sorry, Mr. Latta and Miss Marnie, I'm so sorry, will say more about how we do referrals within school, because we do refer young people to more specialist support if we feel that that would be appropriate.
And shall I jump in and talk a little bit about the kind of school side of it?
Sure.
It does relate to another question that comes in a second as well. But so the kind of in school, Miss Marnie has outlined some of the support services, but if we're sort of thinking broadly in kind of issues around kind of emotional well-being, please bear in mind that obviously your form tutor and your head of year are there to help. But often young people benefit from having someone who is perhaps slightly more bespoke and maybe a bit more flexible and able to kind of talk to them out of lessons and all of that. So we have a learning mentor team that fit within my team that I head up, which is the SEND and inclusion team. And we're also obviously delighted and very fortunate to have Sophia as one of our school counsellors, along with a second school counsellor, Phaedra. So both of them very experienced in delivering support in a school setting. So in other words, there are kind of two routes in the ways that you can access support. One is through the community, through your GP, through CAMS in particular, who are excellent, as Sophia has mentioned. There are a number of private organisations that offer counselling and wellbeing type support as well. But in school, we have a number of support services, and it's up to the families to decide what they feel is most appropriate for their child. Some children, some of our young people want to compartmentalise and perhaps have that support outside of the school setting. Other people find it quite helpful that there is some knowledge and understanding within the school site as well. So it really depends on the family and the young person, but I really do hope that answers your question. If there's any kind of sub questions from that, as I said, please do use the chat. So on that, I'm going to move on, if that's okay, onto it's a really interesting question. Let me just make sure I've got this and I don't paraphrase it. So the question says, is there an anonymous way a parent can ask for support from the Archer? And so that's quite a difficult question. So I'll take it and then I'll ask colleagues to jump in as necessary. So and this is not in any way meaning to be kind of pedantic, but obviously we're not going to be able to support a young person if we don't know who they are. OK, so in that sense, if it's anonymous, it's going to be difficult. But if you mean that we can do this in a confidential way and in a sensitive way, then absolutely. And so one of the things that governs the way we work at all schools, but Archer particularly, is we work on something called a needs to know basis. OK, and so Miss Marnie and myself, particularly in terms of two key members of staff across the school, will often, share information with teachers that a young person might need some additional support or additional care or a bit more flexibility. But we won't necessarily choose to share the reason why, and we don't ever get asked the reason why, because people respect the fact that things work on a needs to know basis. There might be times when a parent or a young person wants us to share specific information with their teachers, and of course we'll do that in discussion with families as well. So that's one part of the question. If you mean completely anonymous, then what I would say is that there are two services that we would probably signpost. One is called Kooth, which is spelled K-O-O-T-H, which is a Barnet-based service, which is for young people and adults, parents rather, who can access for support anonymously. And the other one, which I'm sure many parents and young people will have heard of, but is excellent, is Childline as well. OK, I will just say with my safeguarding hat on that just please bear in mind that if something is shared, that puts the person who is dealing with that inquiry, makes them worried about the well-being of a child, they will always pass that information on. So there's, it's anonymous to a degree. I hope that answers the nuances of that question. But if you need any clarification, please do add into the chat now. I don't know whether Miss Marnie or Sophia, you wanted to add anything to that. It's a tricky question, but I hope I've answered it okay.
Thank you. I was going to mention Kuth also.
That's fine. So in a minute, perhaps when I get a second, I'll drop the link for Kuth into the chat as well. And while I'm talking about the chat or the Q&A, I will just say that I've put the link. If you go back a bit, you'll see the email address for the volunteer email address, which is what Miss Marnie referred to. So if you're interested in volunteering at Archer, the email address is in the Q&A chat. And equally, the link to the survey, which is actually on the slides a short while ago, to the Education Wellbeing Provision Parent Survey, again, is in the chat as well. OK, so I'm going to go back to the chat, if that's OK. So we've got another question saying thank you and would love to hear the talk again, and the previous one, so will they'll be made available. So we've answered that question already. The next question, which I will ask Ms. Marnie, if that's OK, it says, as the children have been apart from friends, how should they approach being back together again? And perhaps, Sophia, you want to comment on this as well.
Thank you. I think that is a very common concern, and I think there are multiple levels to that as well. Again, one is around being overexcited and getting too close and potentially putting themselves at risk. So we've got very clear rules and regulations and expectations about, as a community, how we need to be respectful of one another, because nobody at Archer Academy wants anybody to go home. We want to make sure that we're all in school together. So we're going to have a very community-based collaborative pledge where we all sign up to making sure that we follow COVID-safe rules and we make sure that we are in school and we are safe. But equally, if your child has found lockdown difficult and you're worried about how they return and how they socialise with their friends because they found it hard, because they haven't been talking, then that is something that we definitely can help with. And we have been helping with families following the communication that we've had during this time. We are aware of some families, and they may be you, where your child actually might benefit from coming into school for a bit of socialisation in advance of the return to school. We have got a number of students coming in the afternoons, and if you do feel that your child would need a bit of time before the rest of the school come back in to socialise, we can arrange that. We also have quiet clubs where we can build social time up slowly and carefully. But again, if we don't know how your child's feeling and it hasn't been communicated to us, we will not yet have been able to put that provision in place. We are going to make sure that in the classroom, teachers are planning for socialisation. They are planning for fun. They're going to make sure that your child gets social opportunities and relationship building opportunities within the classroom. We're very aware of that interaction and how important it is. But at the same time, as I've said, if we don't know that your child has found it very difficult or you're a bit worried about them, please contact your child's tutor, head of year, or myself, Mr. Latter, in the chat, and we can then be in touch with you and potentially get your child in early next week.
Can I just add to that, Mr. Latter?
Of course, please do.
I also, can I just go back to the previous question and just add one other component? I think I completely agree with absolutely everything you said. I just wondered whether this was possibly a parent who's thinking more along the lines that they're very worried about their child, but their child doesn't want school to know. So that there could be more a sort of anonymity in the form of, please can you, I want you to know, but I don't want you to tell my child that you know, which I think is really common. I know I'm seeing quite a lot of that in the other setting where I work, and I think it taps into something of our own anxiety, our own fear about some of the behaviours our children may have exhibited over this time. And also I think there's sometimes a shame component of feeling brave enough to say there's a problem. So what I would say is, if that is the case, we're also able to work very flexibly. Just in case it was a parent approaching it from that angle. coming on to the how do we prepare for them coming back, I think let's remember we are a social species. We like contact with one another. Children are brilliant at this. They like being around one another generally. And one of the things I've noticed is that this is just anecdotal. There's not been very much to talk about because they've not been going anywhere or doing anything really. And that's about to change because they're coming back to school. So they are going to have a whole load of things to sort of talk about amongst their friends, and there are going to be events for them to get excited about. I know we're talking about comic relief and various other things coming up. They need some fun. They need some things to look forward to. And I know that at Archer, we will do that really well.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I might go to a question that is very much connected, and I think you can kind of use your judgment about whether we think we've answered this or perhaps if this is on a slightly deeper level. But I'll read the question out. It says, my children have become very isolated and almost scared for seeing other people, including friends, during lockdown. So I kind of note it's got a social friends element, but just generally other people. How can the school help focus on social integration? And I suppose maybe I could come to you, Sophia, on this, but maybe we could distinguish between I guess what you might consider to be kind of more a normal, rational response to this current situation, or whether it might be a sign of something perhaps deeper or more profound that needs some support with.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think it's so important to acknowledge that we've been bombarded with messages from the government to stay at home, to save lives, to not put pressure on the NHS. And our children have taken that on board. They really have. And they've internalised it. And I think we have to be hugely compassionate towards them when they say, I don't want to see people. I think there is a very strong fear component. And I would direct you back to what I said about the reptilian brain. You know, we are operating from a place of fear. We've been living in a fear response state for a long time, and children, we know they're more malleable than adults. They also don't have the long-term perspective, so they're not as good at actually being able to really weigh up fear. I think some of this is about psychoeducation. It's about pointing out that broadly this is beginning to be a good news story. A significant proportion of the population will be vaccinated. We've got testing in school, which is robust and ensures that people should feel safer. That's obviously for children and for the adults. But I think it has to start with empathy. I think we have to empathise with how they feel. And I think conversations that begin with, I can see you're really bothered about this, help me make sense of it, or what can I do that would make you feel safer, will give you a sense of how big a problem this is. I think to feel anxious about this is still normal, completely normal. I'd challenge anyone who hasn't. I think when it tips over into a more concerning potential psychological disorder is when we have rituals around contamination. So we have seen that with some children who've been very anxious either about giving COVID to someone else or catching COVID and making their families ill. And they tend to get drawn into quite ritualistic behaviours around obsessive hand washing or just taking it to the nth degree. And if it's that, the sooner we intervene, generally, the better. So I would say that is absolutely a case where you need some additional support.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was a really comprehensive answer. So I hope the person who's asked that question feels that's really helpful. We've got one more question at the moment, and it does very much feed from that one. So again, you may feel that you've touched upon this, Sophia, but can I read it out and then see if you think there's anything you'd like to add? So first of all, there's some lovely feedback. So it says, this is a really helpful session. Thank you. Please, could you go over the advice you gave on dealing with worries? So that's why there's some overlap. E.g., what if I fail the exams? What if I'm very behind when I return to school? I think you suggested exploring the question with what then, what next? So I don't know if you felt able to expand a little bit on that.
Sorry. You know what? I can do this with a known example. Okay, what if I can't share my PowerPoint? What if I can't unmute myself? You know, then what? So dealing with worries, I think we have to acknowledge that we've expected our children to hold huge anxiety, both about COVID and at the same time, ordinary life has sort of rumbled alongside. So a lot of them are what I would describe as at capacity. And I liken it a bit to a bucket, and it gets fuller and fuller and fuller, and then it starts to spill out in different ways. So what I would say to you is, when we're dealing with worries, I gave the example of what if and then what, and I'll give you some examples of that because I think it's a key one that adolescents are prone to. But generally, it's the stuff that you will know as attuned, available parents. It's containment. Often our children gift us all the stuff they can't manage, and they leave us feeling a bit overwrought, but they feel much better because they've given to us all of that unmanageable stuff. And part of our job as parents is to take it, make sense of it, and deliver it back to them in a less alarming way. So the child that says, you know, what if I fail all my exams? I think part of the reason I encourage a then what approach to that is because it helps to really identify what's catastrophizing and what is proportionate anxiety. The proportionate anxiety in that situation is we don't yet know what it's going to look like for this cohort of year 11. And that's really hard for them. So I think we have to acknowledge, gosh, what must it be like for you to not know? I can imagine you're finding that really scary. No wonder you're having this repeated conversation with yourself of what if, what if? But let's look at it. Okay, what if the exams do go badly? Well, then what? Because there are always options. You may not need those options, but if you go through them, generally you dial down anxiety. So of course we want our children to do well. Of course we want them to go to their sixth form of choice. But if we are able to actually have a conversation with them about, okay, I can see you're really struggling to believe that might happen. So let's imagine it doesn't. Let's imagine the what if comes true, then what? And we strategize for that. Usually what we see is a reduction in anxiety because we have a plan and we like a plan.
Sophia, thank you. It's really, really helpful. I think hopefully our audience is following what Miss Marnie said, is that after you listen to Sophia, you feel more intelligent, and I think you've illustrated that perfectly. We've got one more question. So again, I would encourage you, if you do have a question, you don't need to hold back. You can jump on in there if you'd like us to answer it. But at the moment, there's one more question. And again, Sophia, I feel like I'm picking on you, but I think this probably feels like the most logical. But so it's a really interesting one. So it says, my son told me the other day he is trying not to breathe when he is walking through a crowd. How should I respond to that? And I must admit, I think I've definitely had my moments of doing that as well. So Sophia, I don't know if you'd like to come back on that. We have got another question that's coming, by the way, as well. But
of course, thank you so much for sharing that one, because I think it's likely to be helpful for lots of people listening. So I would be interested. I'd be interested in a few things. Why did your son tell you? I wonder if he was hoping for either confirmation that what he's doing makes sense, or he was hoping for sort of the other side, as it were. So I would begin that with, that's really, you know, it's all those kind of open-ended, try to get teenagers to give a little bit more, because they can clam up, can't they? They go like that, they shut, we can't get in as parents. I know that as a mum of a number of teenagers, and not, well, only two actually, one is creeping up towards that. So I'd be interested, you know, why are you doing that? My hunch would be he's doing it because he's concerned, he's worried in that instance of the air is somehow contaminated. So he's thinking, if I hold my breath, I reduce my likelihood of getting COVID. So I do a little bit of psychoeducation. What do we know about the transmission of COVID? I would check if he's wearing a mask, because what do we know about that? It makes a big difference. And then I would look at the fact that that tells me that his primal brain is going like that, and it's in overdrive. It's trying to assess the threat and it's trying to mitigate it. Well, it makes total sense that a disease that you think you could potentially inhale, if you hold your breath, less likely. But actually a tiny bit of logical thinking tells us it doesn't stack up. And that's when we know it's the reptilian brain in charge. Because the reptilian brain is not capable of applying really cogent, careful thinking. It goes straight to, I've got to keep you safe. So I would never dismiss it. I'm sure you haven't. I would obviously never, and by dismiss, I also mean kind of sort of laugh or reassure. Neither of them will help, I suspect, in this situation. I would say, gosh, it tells me something about how worried you are about potentially catching COVID. Let's talk about that. What's the anxiety? I would talk about how for most young people, COVID is a very mild illness. I would keep putting that point across, because I think teenagers are forgetting that, and I think it's important we say it because it helps to keep it proportionate. And then if your son is open to it, I would talk a bit about the brain, and I would talk about our fear response system and how we get that offline, how we recruit our social engagement system so we can think calmly and logically. But brilliant that he told you, brilliant.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So as I mentioned, there is one more question that's just come in, or a point actually. And before I read this out, I will just encourage all parents and young people, if there are any here, to please do let us know. Miss Marnie said at the beginning, if you've got any particular thoughts about future sessions like this and the topics or the focus for them, we'd love to hear any thoughts. And perhaps as you've heard these talks this evening, some other ideas might have been generated from that. So it's not too late to suggest those. So I'll read out this final point, and it says, I agree, a really useful session. Think I need to discuss, review and agree boundaries, especially around online access, expectations, rewards and consequences as a family. So there's some reflection. As a parent myself, I can relate to that too. And it says, might be a topic for another webinar, for example, or i.e. creating a plan. So I think that's a really nice idea. So, you know, some kind of practical ideas, suggestions about how we might make some of these principles come to life in a way. So I think I'll, you know, thank you. That's a really lovely suggestion. Folks, that is all the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. So what I'll do is formally hand back to Miss Marnie to bring this session to a close.
Thank you so much, Mr. Latter, and thank you so much, Sophia. I hope that as parents, you know that your children are in very good hands, and the most important thing now is that if you do have any concerns, that you let us know, because we are here to help, and that is what we want to do. We are so looking forward to having your children come back next week, and we really hope you're feeling really well supported and prepared. Thank you again for your time this evening. Have a wonderful evening.